Bumpy Man. I think I've posted this story as a comment somewhere before, but nonetheless, I am going to share it again. So, I've always been open to paranormal things. I recall several things as a child, but the older I get, the less I see as adulthood and responsibilities have overtaken my ability to see things that I once did. I had a son in January of 2011. By 2013, when he was almost 2 years old, we moved out of my mother's house into our own apartment. It was kind of a rushed ordeal, as my mother and I butt heads a lot, and as soon as I had the money, I went to the first available opening. The apartment manager had actually asked me to hold on for an extra 2 weeks because, as she said, some girls were moving to Florida and left the place a mess and it needed cleaning up. She never asked for a credit check, any references, anything. It was just an, okay, I'll let you know as soon as the rental is up to par. I moved in probably a month after she said I could have the unit. Upon moving in, I had a strange but comforting feeling. I started out with nothing but a box of toys and a nice blow up mattress for myself and my almost 2-year-old son to share. It was a 2 bedroom apartment, 1 bathroom, lots of closet space. Eventually, we made it home. But one day, my son was in the spare bedroom, what was going to be his room, and started laughing. A hearty baby laugh that takes work to muster from any baby, really. I walk in, and he is staring at a corner and acts as though he doesn't even see me in there. Then suddenly he stops. Anyone with a child knows this is a little odd. The child will normally look to the source of entertainment for more, but my son just stopped and toddled toward me as if told to do so. It seemed odd, but I dismissed it. Fast forward a few months, we've got our own beds, although I let him sleep in mine, and I awake one night to him belly laughing once again, full on giggles in the darkness. Nothing but the moonlight through the sheer curtains bouncing from my face onto his, since I'm the one facing the window, and he's looking over my shoulder into the darkness. A big smile is spread over his face as I say, "What's so funny, my honey?" And he says, "The man," as he's still gazing over my shoulder. But then his smile gets scared and serious, and he puts his tiny finger over his lips as though he's mimicking someone, and he says, "Ch no mama, no man, go night." Needless to say, I did not go night night that night. Days, weeks passed, and small incidents happened where he'd be laughing or talking about his friend. I started not worrying about it because to me, it wasn't that big of a deal. He stopped being creepy at night. One day, though, he was in what was supposed to be his room just cracking up laughing once again. When he came into the living room, I asked him, "What's so funny in there, bud?" And he replied, "The man, he's funny. He tell me jokes. He not a monster. He tell me jokes. He nice, mama." I was like, "Ooh, look, he's got an imaginary friend. Wonderful. Whatever." This goes on another week or two until one day he's in his room having a full conversation. I don't recall what. I just remember hearing him chatting in there, as if having an actual conversation, and him repeating a word I knew he didn't know. Too big for an almost 2-year-old's vocabulary. He comes into the living room and I ask again, "Who are you talking to in there?" He says, "The man, mama." I knew I shouldn't ask, but I did, and I said, "What's the man look like?" And he replies, "Bumpy. He's bumpy, mom. Look like monster, but not a monster, mom. He nice. He tell me jokes. He nice." I am sitting there like, okay, cool. This is totally an imaginary friend. All is fine. And that was that. A few days later, I wake up suddenly to a fight in the hallway. My next door neighbor had come home drunk and was banging her apartment door like a complete psycho. I had grown up rather comfortable in a town where literally locking your doors was optional, so for once I went to the door to lock it so this woman wouldn't accidentally open my door, and it was already locked. The door handle, the deadbolt, and the chain lock. I had never locked the deadbolt, let alone the chain lock. I was confused but wrote it off as me being a tired mom. The next morning, bright and early, my son wakes me to, "Mama, the man saves us." He locked door from bad lady, mama. Again, I write it off as he heard the commotion the night before and credited his imaginary friend for my actions. Later that day, I had just gotten a carload of groceries, and I took the first few bags in and up the stairs, and I got a movie in for my son to occupy him while I got the rest inside. I go out on maybe the third or fourth trip, and a neighbor catches me. She's my age. I hadn't met her before, but she seems kind. She approaches me and introduces herself, then asks, maybe this isn't appropriate, but how much did you pay for that apartment? I didn't exactly know the rules to how units were priced or what have you, so I just vaguely asked why, and she said, well, did they tell you what happened there? And I was like, no. She said she was waiting on some girls to move out who were going to Florida, but I trailed off. She says, no, there was a dad and son who lived in there. They both had that like genetic disease where you get bumps or polyps all over your skin. The son killed himself in the spare bedroom by overdosing. Nobody knew for days. They had all sorts of cleaning crews in there. It's a shame too, because he'd always tell my kids jokes and say, see, I tell jokes. I'm not a monster, he was so sweet to my boys. He was so worried about scaring them. He'd always tell them jokes.
How was my father in two places at once?
First off, a little backstory on my dad. The man has so much character and color to him. Though he is mostly a chilled out grandpa at this point, whose biggest offenses are the likes of placing a box of dead kittens in the topic hat when the family plays charades at the Christmas Eve get together. When I was a kid, he was a crazy person. He was an amazing father, honest to a fault, and had character made of stone. He apologized when he felt he was wrong, and he would sit and cry with you when things were eating away at your self esteem. However, as much as I owe him my morality and compassion towards others, I also owe him my extremely demented and nothing is sacred sense of humor. The man got more joy from life in tormenting his children than anything else. We lived on my grandmother's farm in rural Tennessee, and when the power would go out, which happened a lot in our area, he would dare me to run to the mailbox and then lock me outside at 10 o'clock at night when I'm about 10 years old, and he would laugh so hard I could hear him over my screams while I banged on the door from the outside, pleading to be let back in. He was the type of dad to wake you up in the morning by revving a chainsaw, change the clocks in the house to make you get ready for school at 2 a.m. and stand on the front porch in his tidy whities while you were getting on the bus in the morning and yell, I love you, I'm gonna miss you so bad, in a voice that could only imply that he was suffering from severe brain damage. In other words, he was always looking for a way to scare you, embarrass you, or just make you have such a crazy, unexpected experience that you would be guaranteed to remember him forever. And it worked. I loved that man. Now, that was needed for context. And this story takes place in my second to last year on my grandmother's farm. I was 17 and had been working a job in my small town stocking beer coolers and mopping floors at the local gas station. I was driving home from work in my little truck at about 10 p.m., and as I pulled into the driveway, my headlights shone up the hill to my grandmother's house and panned down the hill to the edge of our single wide mobile home. I stopped immediately, all four tires in the driveway pointing straight to end of that straight stretch of gravel. I could see my dad. His old flatbed truck and my stepmother's minivan were parked pointing to the left at the base of our trailer. He was standing behind them with his back to my headlights. Our chocolate lab, Cassie, sat at his feet, staring intently at him, paying no attention to the vehicle entering her territory, which was highly unlike her. I only stopped because it was so late, and so unusual for my dad to be outside at this time. It was in the middle of the week. He was usually passed out in his recliner, wearing nothing but his underwear with the History Channel, quietly rambling on about the Civil War by this time. I slowly proceeded down the drive. Our driveway was about half a football field in length, and as I drove slowly toward the bottom of the drive, my dad began to walk, still with his back turned to me, and stepped behind the vehicles, the height of my stepmom's van fully concealing him. It took another 15 seconds from that point for me to reach the end of the drive, and I pulled my truck in on the side of his flatbed, leaving me closest to the road. I grabbed my big gulp and got out of the truck. Dad? No response. Dad? Still nothing. Immediately I got a bit creeped out, but then thought to myself nearly as quick. This dude is trying to scare me again. He must think I didn't see him. I got down on my knee and peered under the vehicles. His left boot, unmistakable. Cassie's back legs and butt right beside him, tail tucked between her legs. I hollered out, "You're doing a crappy job of hiding, Dad. I can see your boot sticking out from behind the tire on the van." I watched as his left boot slowly slid to the right until it was concealed behind the tire with the other. Still no response. I called for the dog. Cassie. She turned and literally scurried beneath the vehicles to get to me as if she was under heavy gunfire. She was whimpering when she got to me and acting very strange, as if she was terrified. She was acting how I would imagine a dog would act if they were constantly beat on, and I had never seen her behave that way before. When she got to me and I placed my hand on her, you could almost hear her breathe a sigh of relief. She was sticking to my legs like glue, and as I was still down on one knee and a bit off balance, she nearly knocked me over. I pet on her for a moment and tried to comfort her, but she seemed like she was afraid of something. With her tail still tucked between her legs, she pushed herself in between my legs as I stood up. It was after seeing how timid and odd Cassie was acting that I decided that I may be misreading the situation and I might need to get into the house. My dad was surely a prankster, but when he was caught, he was caught. He never drug things out once we caught on. He would come out and say something like, "I guess you kids ain't as gullible as you used to be. I'm gonna have to start stepping it up a notch." Dad didn't drink much and never got drunk really, but I couldn't think of what the root of this odd behavior could possibly be, and it really started to weird me out. I made one last attempt at communication. "Dad, I know you're there. I saw you when I pulled in the driveway. The jig is up. What are you doing out here?" No response. I started around the front of my truck to round the vehicles and walk over to him. Cassie began to panic and whimper loudly, still glued to the inside of my ankles, crouched to the gravel with her head darting back and forth wildly. I stopped in front of my truck. I stand there for another moment in silence, waiting for something, but not sure what, and then announce, "Well, I'm heading in. See you in a bit, weirdo." I turned to walk to the front porch, unconsciously building speed as I hit the first step. Cassie drops back and doesn't follow me onto the porch, but seems to sort of stand guard at the foot of the steps. Keys in hand, I'm already searching for the deadbolt key. Panic is building in my chest, but I'm not sure why. I hurriedly unlock the door and jump into the house, swing around and slam the door behind me, locking the deadbolt all in one fluid motion. From behind me, I hear a voice yell, "What the hell?" I spin around. My big gulp drops to the floor and explodes across the living room floor. There sits my dad, in his underwear, sitting up from a deep sleep in his recliner. I begin to hyperventilate and yell through gasps of air that there is a man in the driveway hiding behind the van. "I thought he was you. I was talking to him, Dad." I nearly collapsed into the floor. Within 15 seconds my dad is running out the back door of the house with a spotlight and a handgun, still wearing nothing but his underwear. He was outside for what felt like forever. When he came in he was pale as a sheet. He said someone was definitely out there, but he couldn't see them. He could hear them running, but when he pointed the spotlight in the direction of the footsteps, there was no one there. Crazy thing is, our trailer sat at the front of a 150-acre cornfield, and it was off-season, so everything was still down to the dirt. There was nowhere for anyone to hide. It was a terrifying experience, and I know it's one that seems easy to explain. My brain really wants to tell me that I had just foiled a car thief or something, or maybe even stopped a possible home invasion. The thing is, though, my dad has an unmistakable posture and an even more unmistakable walk. I know those were his boots I saw under the van. I also know that if he had somehow set all this up, I would have heard about it for years, because it would have been one of his favorite stories to tell. How he scared me so bad when I was 17, and how funny it would have been. He does tell people about this from time to time, but he always ends with the same detail. That it wasn't until he was outside running around in his underwear with a handgun that I realized that Cassie had been sleeping in the floor next to his recliner when I ran in the door. I've only told this story to my closest friend. I live in the deep woods in southern Missouri. The nearest civilization outside a trailer house down the road is a gas station town a couple miles away. I've lived here since I was 6 months old and spent my days in the woods. I don't remember a time where I didn't know the winding paths and clearings like the back of my hand. There were always stories of something in the woods. A local tribesman told tale of a spirit that wandered the woods at night. I was deeply invested in stories of ghosts and monsters and that sort of stuff, so the tribesman's tale was pretty run of the mill. I didn't think much of it until a few years ago. One night in around 2010, I was walking the usual trail and got a feeling that something wasn't right. It was like I was walking 3 feet behind my body. It was the sound of a snapping branch that brought my body and mind back together. But it wasn't a twig or a small limb. It was a large oak branch about as wide as me. It hit the ground with a hard thud. After that, the woods became completely silent. No owls or coyotes howling, not even the night breeze. The only sound was my own stunned breathing. Out of the darkness, two glowing yellow eyes looked directly at me from the shadows. They were several yards down the trail, yet still seemed several feet off the ground. A low, thundering growl came from the same direction. It was like the growl of a tiger mixed with a bear. I wanted to run back home, but my legs wouldn't budge. My breathing picked up and became more and more like gasping for air. The growling stopped as the creature started to turn around to go deeper into the woods, showing me its form in the moonlight. It didn't seem of this world. I can only describe it as a black mountain lion with the head and body size of a grizzly bear. It looked like it hadn't ate in a month. It was nothing more than skin and bones. Only when I was alone again in the woods would my legs let me sprint back home and lock myself in my room with a survival knife. Occasionally, on the quietest nights of the year, I can hear it outside my window, and the same eyes from that night appear out of the darkness. I never go outside without my knife anymore, even during the day. I've had several friends that have come over for the day, go home that night, and tell me of how they feel like they are being watched from outside. A man in the dark. Hi all. This happened to me about 11 years ago, when walking home from a friend's house at night. I'll just get straight into it. I used to live in a rural part of the UK and have lived in rural areas most of my life, so I was used to long walks, occasionally at night, especially before I could drive. They never bothered me too much. I'd get creeped out occasionally, but this one night was the most terrifying experience I ever had. There was this one friend who used to live roughly 3 miles away from my house. He had cool parents and my other friends, and I would often go over his house and play video games and hang out. Occasionally, this meant walking home at night if I stayed late. There were two ways back from his house: the roadway, which was about 5 miles long and took about 30 to 45 minutes. The roads were very quiet and eerie sometimes, but they were lit by street lamps, so it never bothered me walking this way. The other way was a shortcut through some woods, which took off about 2 miles, and the wooded bit was about a mile or so long. I often favored the wooded shortcut and have probably walked it over 100 times. The woods were dark, however, combined with the lack of ambient light due to living in a rural area, and you had absolute abyssal darkness. Luckily, most of the time I had my phone light to walk with, but sometimes my phone would die or the battery would be so low the flash wouldn't work and I'd have to use my screen light. As you've probably guessed by now, This was one of those occasions. I remember my friends and I had just finished watching the film. It was nearing 10 p.m., so we all left my friend's house and headed our separate ways home. I contemplated briefly which way I should go and decided to take the shortcut through the woods. I started walking away from his house and towards the path that headed into the woods. The streetlights dimmed as I entered the fields before the woods. I glanced at my phone and saw my battery was really low, only enough power left for a couple of minutes of flash, and then I'd have to use my screen for light. That wouldn't last the whole way either. As I saw the tree line approaching, I switched on the flash and followed the well-trodden path into the dark. To my dismay, my light died within seconds of entering, and I flipped my phone over to try and shine the way using the screen. As I walked, I looked out for all of the familiar landmarks I was used to seeing to ensure I was heading in the right direction. Funky tree stump check, half-fallen fir tree check, enormous puddle I had to jump over check. All was going well. I was halfway through the woods when my phone completely died. I remember the moment it happened. I was engulfed in darkness. I'm not sure if you've experienced this level of darkness before, but it was so dark, I couldn't even see the outline of my hand centimeters in front of my face. Naturally, my pace slowed considerably, and I started holding my hand out in front of me to make sure I wasn't going to walk into a tree or something. I continued walking for another minute or so until all of a sudden a pungent smell hit me. Cigarette smoke. I glanced around but couldn't see anything. Then I heard it, a cough. I wasn't alone. Thoughts raced through my head. Who would be out in the woods in the dark? Are they following me? Am I lost? I quickened my pace again, throwing a little caution to the wind. I carried on walking and tripped slightly on a branch. As I regained my balance, I heard another sound. Branches breaking underfoot, what sounded like right behind me. The snapping turned into fast footsteps that grew louder and louder. I started sprinting. I felt the well-trodden path turn to brush. I felt branches, logs, and plants hitting my legs. It wasn't long before I fell hard. I was lying on the floor, holding my knee. I could still hear branches snapping around me and a voice muttering something. I didn't dare move. Then, all of a sudden, they turned on a torch. I couldn't see anything except for the beam of light which seemed to be eaten quickly by the darkness of the forest. I lay motionless on the ground as the beam swept through the trees. I could still hear the person mumbling, a deep growl. The crunching of footfalls grew and grew. They were only several feet from me by this point. I couldn't breathe. The light went out, the snapping of branches grew, and then nothing. Quiet. My eyes were wide open, but I couldn't see anything. Then I could hear wheezing, right above me. I wanted to cry. I wasn't sure if the person could see me or not. They could have been staring right at me, and I wouldn't know. This carried on for about 5 minutes until the crunching of leaves and snapping of twigs started up again and got fainter and fainter as they moved away from me. I remained lying down for another 5 or 10 minutes, contemplating my escape. Like an idiot, I'd ran off the path and wasn't sure which way was back to it, or was home. I didn't really care, I thought. I was going to walk in one direction until I left the woods and get home from there. I knew as soon as I started moving again, if the person was still in the woods, they would hear me. Should I run or try and sneak out? I opted for the latter. I slowly rose to my feet, listening constantly to my surroundings, picked a direction, and started walking. I wasn't perfectly quiet, but quiet enough to be sure I wouldn't be heard from too far away. I kept hearing snapping sounds and rustling in the distance, and every time I froze, I'd hold my breath until I was happy no one was there and then start walking again. I repeated this pattern for what felt like an eternity until eventually I found the path. I screamed for joy in my mind and sped up my pace. After another 10 minutes I saw it. Light. Streetlights filtering in through the trees. I'd never been so happy to see a meager street lamp. But as I progressed to the end of the woods, my heart sank. At the end of the path was a black silhouette. Unmoving, contrasted against the light background, was the dark figure of a man. What should I do? Maybe it's a different person. Perhaps it's someone walking their dog. I froze and watched them silently, but they didn't move at all. They just stood there like they were guarding the entrance to the woods. I didn't know what to do. By this point, I'd had enough. I was so close to getting out, I decided to just run straight towards the exit, straight towards them. I was a 6FT young man. If they wanted to stop me, they'd have a hard job of it, I thought. So that's what I did. I started sprinting. The figure grew and grew, and as I reached them, I stepped to the side. I heard someone growl "fuck" loudly and felt something clip the back of my head and tug the back of my jacket. I cleared the sheep gate in one leap and sprinted into the light. I eventually stopped running when I could see the first house and looked back. The entrance to the woods was quite far away now, and I couldn't see anyone standing by the entrance. Relaxing a bit more now, I finished my walk home. That's pretty much it. I know I could have overreacted. It could have been someone out for a walk in the woods, a dog walker or camper. But what I thought was strange was that they didn't use their torch except briefly on one occasion. Once they heard me, they also actively seeked me out. Who knows what would have happened if they caught me? In any case, I never walked that way home alone again, not at night anyway.